Okay, so I was at a family dinner a couple of weeks ago. Pretty standard stuff, small talk, complaining about traffic. Then my uncle starts talking. He's not really an angry guy, just nostalgic, I guess.
Right.
And he sighs and says he just misses the days when everyone got along and we weren't all so divided.
Ah, that sentiment. Yeah.
And the whole table just tensed up. My younger cousin, who'd been pretty quiet, she just looked up from her plate and asked, when exactly was that? The getting along part.
Ooh.
Yeah, she went on, was that during Jim Crow? Or when they were marching indigenous families to death? I'm just trying to pin down the date.
Wow. Direct.
You could have heard a pin drop. My uncle got all red-faced, started talking about respect and bringing politics into everything. But that wasn't even the most interesting part.
What was?
The really interesting part was my aunt, the one who posts all the be kind memes online.
Okay.
She immediately jumped in looking totally panicked. Okay, that's enough, she said. Let's just change the subject. We're all family. We just want unity.
Ah, the deflection.
Exactly. She didn't address the question, didn't engage with the history at all. She just tried to shove the truth right back into the box so everyone could go back to pretending. And right then, it hit me. Her desperate call for unity and my uncle's nostalgia for the good old days, they were the exact same thing.
How so?
They weren't afraid of division. They were afraid of exposure. And that moment, that instant panic when history gets exposed, when the deep structural divisions underneath everything are laid bare, that's exactly what we're deep diving into today.
Right. It's a fundamental tension.
How does a nation, specifically the United States, try to reconcile its historical evils, these persistent structures of exclusion, with its modern identity and this constant political call for unity?
Yeah, what happens when the truth kind of bursts out of the box?
And why does that call for unity so often seem like a shield against real accountability?
Well, we've got a couple of really powerful conceptual tools from the research that help us get beyond just individual prejudice and analyze this structurally. These concepts really explain the depth of the division that call for unity tries to paper over. So the first one is citizenism.
Citizenism, okay.
Yeah, it's a critical legal framework. It describes how citizenship, which sounds race neutral, right?
No, seems neutral.
But it's actually mobilized and, weaponized to sustain structural racism and systematically limit the rights of communities of color. And the second concept is the judgment of history.
Right.
This is a really powerful political and philosophical critique of that long-standing idea that the modern state is, the inevitable benevolent agent of progress and justice.
The idea that history is always moving forward towards good.
Exactly. It forces us to question that whole assumption, that linear moral path towards the liberal nation state.
Okay, so our mission today is to really distill how America's structural past, this persistent original sin of exclusion, continues to define the rights and privileges of citizens today.
And also how this internal domestic struggle is seen and maybe even strategically leveraged on the global stage.
Right. Let's unpack this. We should start with the mechanism itself, citizenism.
Okay, so let's define citizenism really explicitly. It's a formalized, legalized system of discrimination.
Legalized, okay.
Yeah, and it uses citizenship status to perpetuate racialized outcomes for communities of color. But what's really crucial here, it goes beyond just formal status.
Oh.
Because the historical and legal construction of whiteness kind of underwrites the only presumptively legitimate racial category for full citizenship rights. Whiteness becomes the default.
Got it. So the key takeaway there is that the very idea of U.S. citizenship gets used as a proxy for race.
Precisely.
It's not just about treating non-citizens badly. It's about setting up white citizenship as the permanent, unquestioned standard for having full rights. And under that system, the status of citizens of color, it doesn't matter how many generations they've been in the U.S., it's made perpetually suspect, kind of conditionally foreign.
Exactly. Conditionally foreign. It advances structural subordination across race, indigeneity, class, immigration status, all tangled together. And, citizenism is especially insidious now in this era where the really explicit race laws have supposedly been dismantled.
Right. We don't have laws saying white only anymore.
Exactly. So it relies on these seemingly non-racial categories, things like legality, status, or national security, to actually fortify structural racism.
Sneakier, in a way.
Very. And to understand its power, we really have to trace the deep history of exclusion. It shows that that race wasn't some accidental flaw in U.S. citizenship, it was always the central organizing principle.
And the most explicit starting point for that, the legal coding of this structure, goes right back to the beginning, doesn't it? Almost immediately after the founding.
Correct. The Naturalization Act of 1790. It established that only a free white person could naturalize as a U.S. citizen.
Free white person. That phrase did so much work.
It really did. It set the fundamental racial bar for citizenship for decades. But critically, the definition of white wasn't simple or biological. It was incredibly flexible, legally constructed.
Manipulated, really.
Yes, and interpreted narrowly to serve political and economic interests. It ended up limiting naturalization almost exclusively to people of Western European descent.
And that legal construction process required some truly astonishing mental gymnastics, didn't it? Especially when Asian immigrants started arriving in larger numbers. You see the system actively choosing between science and social perception right there in the Supreme Court.
Oh, absolutely. Look at the Ozawa v. United States case in 1922. Takao Ozawa, born in Japan, lived in the U.S. for 20 years, spoke English, educated in American schools, met all the requirements except that racial one.
Right.
And he argued pretty astutely that since his skin was lighter than some people considered Caucasian, he should be classified as free white.
But the court said no. They ruled that even though he might look fair, he was clearly of a race which is not Caucasian in the, quote, common understanding of the term.
Right. They relied on the popular meaning, the perception, not any scientific definition. And then, just the very next year, 1923, the United States v. Thind case comes along and reveals the staggering hypocrisy.
Yeah, tell us about Thind.
Bhagat Singh Thind, a high-caste Hindu man from India. He argued that anthropologists classified his people as Aryan, making him scientifically Caucasian. He actually met the scientific test that Ozawa had failed.
So logically, he should have been in, right?
You'd think. But the court completely reversed its logic.
Unbelievable.
They said scientific classification didn't matter one bit. Since Mr. Thind wasn't perceived by the average man to be white or of European descent, that common sense understanding again, he was denied naturalization. The law had to be, quote, pragmatic. So this pair of rulings just lays it bare. Whiteness was a purely political and economic category.
Designed to exclude.
Exactly. Designed to be exclusionary regardless of science or individual merit. These rulings cemented that legal construction of race that fundamentally shaped U.S. citizenship for, well, decades, until 1952.
So the structure was built to ensure the gates of citizenship were always racially managed. But it wasn't just about who could become a citizen through naturalization, right? The legal system also used explicit racial exclusion to limit the rights of people already living in territories the U.S. acquired, sometimes even overriding treaties.
Absolutely. Take what happened after the Mexican-American War. The 1848 Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo supposedly gave Mexican residents in the newly acquired territory the choice to become U.S. citizens.
Supposedly.
Right. But local and state laws quickly bypassed the treaty's spirit. The California Constitution, for example, granted U.S. citizenship only to those Mexicans who could be classified as white.
Wow. So they were actively classifying these new potential citizens based on whether they were racially mixed with indigenous or black people.
If they were racially mixed, they were excluded from the full privileges of citizenship, despite what the treaty said.
That is citizenism in its absolute purest form right there.
Yeah.
Setting up internal racial classifications to get around external legal promises.
And of course, the foundation for this kind of legal distinction was really laid down in Dred Scott v. Sanford back in 1857.
The infamous Dred Scott decision.
Which held that black people whose ancestors were enslaved were not and could never be citizens. The whole point of that ruling was to preserve the political community for white people, to ensure black Americans had, quote, no rights which the white man was bound to respect.
This history is just so critical. It explains why, even though those explicit racial restrictions on citizenship technically ended in 1952, the underlying legal architecture, that presumption, it remains.
Exactly. That legacy allows the modern immigration system to function today as a really sophisticated, racialized caste system, all under the supposedly neutral idea of illegality. And this framework gets operationalized in daily life through these concepts that effectively illegalize citizens of color. Concepts like speaking like an illegal and looking like an illegal.
Those phrases are chilling.
They're the mechanisms that reproduce that subordinate status and lead to unequal treatment for citizens and non-citizens alike, based purely on perception.
And to really get the human cost of this system, we need to look at it through the lens of critical Latinx indigeneities, or CLIs.
Yes, that's a vital perspective.
It helps us see how categories like illegality are compounded by these intersecting oppressions, rooted in displacement in colonial history. It really emphasizes the identity of the Latinx community as rooted in this global history of displacement and, well, borders being drawn across their lands.
That's absolutely right. Consider the story of Aurora Medina Martinez. She spent decades of her life mastering what she called the art of invisibility.
The art of invisibility.
Her family history spans 7 generations of what's aptly called generational illegality, over 120 years of just navigating life on the borderlands.
And that history includes her great-great-grandfather, who worked as a bracero, right? One of those temporary guest workers recruited through agreements specifically to provide cheap, racialized labor.
Exactly. And that whole labor system was completely dependent on the constant threat and fear of la migra, of immigration enforcement. Aurora and her sisters, they were the backbone of wealthy Southern California homes. They worked as live-in maids, nannies, all while living in constant fear of deportation.
The sacrifice involved is just immense.
Staggering. Aurora had to leave her own children behind for years during crucial formative years just to work in the U.S. for basic economic survival.
And her denial of her own indigenous ancestry, even though she had visible indigenous features, that's framed not just as a personal choice, is it?
Not at all. It's seen as a direct product of that colonial trauma, a desperate generational attempt to assimilate, to avoid the criminalization and exclusion that comes with being marked as other. Her story really shows how the state uses the concept of the illegal other, not just to control borders, but as this permanent racial anchor. It subordinates entire communities, regardless of who actually has a birth certificate.
Right. The trauma doesn't just disappear once you get citizenship.
No. It persists. Even after she finally achieved citizenship in the late 1990s, that illegalization shapes her identity. It leaves her feeling perpetually like an outsider in a world that profits from her labor but denies her basic humanity. Okay, so this is where we shift to how citizenism actually plays out in large-scale state actions.
Right, the big historical example.
Exactly. Citizenism permits the suppression of the rights of citizens of color whenever that state action is justified by this racialized fear of immigrants of color.
So fear becomes the justification.
And when that fear is operationalized, citizenship status for these targeted communities becomes precarious, fragile, and ultimately removable.
And the history of this kind of systematic removal is one of the most, I think, forgotten violations of constitutional rights in the U.S.
Yeah.
Let's look at case 1, the mass deportations of Mexican Americans during the 1930s and again in the 1950s.
Yeah, during the 1930s, repatriation, which was really driven by the economic anxiety of the Great Depression.
Blaming immigrants for economic problems, a classic move.
Absolutely. State and local authorities launched these highly visible anti-alien campaigns, mostly in the Southwest and Midwest. Over 1 million people of Mexican descent were removed or driven out of the United States.
And the truly shocking figure, the one that really underscores citizenism, is that approximately 60% of those people were U.S. citizens.
60% U.S. citizens. It was described at the time as a terror reign, a deportation mania.
Targeting one specific ethnic group under the guise of making sure only true Americans had jobs.
And these citizens were stripped of their homes, their property, their livelihoods with almost no legal recourse whatsoever. And then this pattern repeats itself less than 20 years later with Operation Wetback in 1954.
The name itself is just horrific.
It was a military-style operation. Using convoys, surveillance, they deported 1.1 million Mexican nationals. Police raided public spaces, even churches, forcing people who looked Mexican onto trains and buses headed straight for the border.
And again, this resulted in massive property loss, irreparable family separation, and it affected hundreds of thousands of U.S. citizens who just got caught in the dragnet because of how they looked.
The systematic targeting based on ethnic appearance proved that citizenship status was essentially worthless when the state decided a specific racial group posed some kind of threat. Now consider case 2. The mass internment of Japanese Americans during World War II.
Another massive violation.
Over 110,000 people of Japanese descent, crucially 2/3 of them were U.S. citizens, were forcibly evacuated and interned without any semblance of due process, all based on Executive Order 9066.
And the anti-Asian racism behind it was incredibly deep-seated, wasn't it? Officials explicitly racialized Japanese Americans as enemy aliens, completely regardless of their loyalty or their citizenship status.
General DeWitt's infamous 1943 quote just sums up the logic of citizenism perfectly. It makes no difference whether he is an American. Theoretically, he is still a Japanese, and you can't change him.
Wow. Their inherent racial essence, deemed foreign and untrustworthy, just completely superseded their legal status as citizens.
And this inherent suspect status was then legally enshrined by the Supreme Court in Korematsu v. United States in 1944.
The Korematsu decision, yeah.
The court upheld the exclusion order. They found that the compulsory exclusion of large groups of citizens was acceptable under circumstances of direst emergency and peril. And the critical legal linkage here, the doctrine the court used, was this concept of extreme judicial deference to military judgment during wartime.
Basically, the military says it's necessary, so we won't question it.
Pretty much. They rationalize violating citizens' rights by placing national security concerns, even if those concerns were based on thinly veiled racial animus above fundamental constitutional guarantees.
And the deep implication, the really chilling part of this research, is that the core doctrine of Korematsu, that deference principle, it actually remains legal precedent today, doesn't it?
That's a vital connection to make. While the specific facts of the Korematsu case have been widely condemned, its underlying reasoning, that deference to the executive and national security matters, was recently embraced in Trump v. Hawaii in 2018.
The travel ban case.
Exactly. In Trump v. Hawaii, the court cited that very same doctrine of deference to the executive branch on issues related to national security, and that permitted these blanket forms of state discrimination against specific nationalities.
So it sets this dangerous precedent. It proves that the racialized suppression of rights, once it's codified in law, can just be dusted off and applied to new racial or national targets.
Which brings us right up to case 3, the racialization of Arab and Muslim Americans post 9/11. Following the attacks, federal and local actions severely limited the civil rights of Arab and Muslim Americans, again, regardless of their citizenship status, often under the broad guise of counterterrorism.
The USA Patriot Act being a key example.
Right. Enacted in 2001, it granted these incredibly expansive surveillance powers. And critically, these resources were used with profoundly racialized impacts. Under the Act, law enforcement often needed no minimal proof, not probable cause, not even reasonable suspicion, to connect someone to a counterterrorism investigation.
And the result was just this complete erosion of privacy and civil liberties for that entire community. I mean, think about the NYPD's secret surveillance program that operated until 2011.
Yeah, that was shocking. They explicitly mapped, monitored, and analyzed American Muslim daily life across 4 states. They targeted mosques, businesses, solely because they were Muslim.
They deployed mosque crawlers, installed surveillance cameras for nearly a decade, affecting thousands of U.S. citizens.
And yet the chief of the NYPD testified that the entire unit did not yield a single criminal lead in 6 years.
6 years, 0 leads.
It was discrimination based purely on perceived fraudulence and illegality, targeting an entire community as perpetually suspect.
So it's absolutely clear that this presumption of illegality or foreignness is the core operational engine of citizenism. Let's circle back to how that presumption plays out in everyday life for Latinx citizens through those constructs of looking like and speaking like an illegal.
Yeah. These concepts function as racial proxies. They effectively give law enforcement officials carte blanche to violate the rights of citizens. Look at the 2019 case of Francisco Irwin Galicia.
The teenager in Texas.
Right, U.S.-born Latino teenager. He was stopped at a Border Patrol checkpoint and presented his U.S. birth certificate, his social security card, his state ID, all valid.
He had all the proof. But
despite providing official U.S. documentation, CBP agents accused him of using fake documents.
he's based on how he looked.
Presumably. He was arrested, detained, incarcerated for nearly a month, endured serious psychological trauma, severe weight loss. His testimony indicated he nearly signed a deportation order just because he didn't want to suffer anymore.
The documents meant nothing because his racial identity made his status inherently suspect in their eyes.
Exactly. And similarly, the way citizens are treated differs based on racialized language markers. Consider Ana Suda and Martha Hernandez, 2 U.S. citizens detained at a Montana grocery store back in 2018.
Why were they detained?
Simply for speaking Spanish.
Just for speaking Spanish.
Yeah. When they asked the CBP officer why, he replied that speaking Spanish was very unheard of up here.
Wow.
And when Ana Suda pushed back, asking if they would have been detained for speaking French, the officer's supervisor actually admitted, no, we don't do that.
That contrast just lays it bare. It powerfully illustrates that the enforcement is explicitly racialized.
A white Canadian citizen speaking French near the border, no problem.
Right.
A U.S. citizen speaking Spanish, presumed guilty of speaking like an illegal.
And we have to remember the geopolitical space this happens in. The Supreme Court allows CBP officials to conduct warrantless stops, searches, and arrests within the 100 miles of U.S. borders.
A huge area where millions live.
With mere reasonable suspicion, not probable cause.
Right. And this 100-mile zone disproportionately impacts communities of color, especially Latinx, who live in larger concentrations within it. It basically ensures unequal treatment under the law is built right into the geography of enforcement.
Okay, let's pivot now. We've talked about citizenism as this internal systemic failure. Now let's look at this concept of the judgment of history, how nations frame their moral standing over time.
Right.
You know, that secular call to history is often invoked like this guarantee that eventually good will triumph and the nation will redeem itself. Like history itself will deliver justice.
And that reliance on the judgment of history rests on a really fundamental assumption. This idea of a progressive, linear view of time.
Things are always getting better.
Exactly. That culminates in the modern liberal nation-state, positioning it as the ultimate agent of reason and justice, the telos, the endpoint of history. The state becomes the moral and political embodiment of inevitable progress.
But the core contradiction there is pretty stark, isn't it? The universalist premise of human rights is constantly being compromised by the state's need to respect its own sovereign and nationally based needs, what's called raison d'etat, the reason of state. So while the state preaches universal rights, it always retains the right to use violence and exclusion to maintain its own stability and prosperity.
Exactly. And international law, especially after World War II, really reinforced this progressive view by drawing the sharp distinction between good states and bad states.
The winners and the losers.
Pretty much. The bad states were defined as these anomalies or maybe archaic remnants of a barbaric past, and this justified the actions of the good states as just part of the ongoing progress of civilization.
And this structure is perfectly illustrated by the legacy of the Nuremberg Tribunal after WWII, isn't it? How did the victorious nations, specifically the U.S., manage to position themselves as the sole agents of justice coming out of that?
Well, the Nuremberg proceedings in 1946 were incredibly instrumental in cementing the nation-state as the highest political achievement. Chief Prosecutor Robert Jackson, an American Supreme Court justice,
Right.
He was extremely careful to distinguish the Nazis' atrocities, their racism, their genocide, by attributing them specifically to aggressive warfare and individual pathology, calling it brigandage.
So focusing on the war part, not the racism part, is inherent to state power.
Precisely. He avoided framing it as systemic violence inherent in legitimate state power and raison d'etat.
So Jackson effectively defined legitimate state violence, like the violence used by the Allies, as civilized, suggesting it was acceptable, while the violence of the Nazis was uniquely criminal because it involved crossing borders aggressively.
The tribunal's charter actually helped this distinction because it didn't clearly define aggressive warfare, but that ambiguity was necessary. It separated German incursions across national borders from what was seen as the necessary violence of sovereign powers protecting themselves. And the profound effect of this framing was that by treating Nazism as this total exception, this archaic remnant,
The victorious states got to obscure their own domestic atrocities.
exactly, they declared the evil of systematic racism to be primarily an issue of the defeated enemy, rather than a global structural reality that implicated them too.
The hypocrisy there is just staggering when you think about it. Jackson's narrow focus on aggressive warfare allowed the U.S. to completely avoid scrutiny of its own history of domestic evils. Like, state-sanctioned lynching of thousands of African Americans was still happening in the U.S. well into the mid-20th century.
And even more chillingly, there's research showing that U.S. race law, particularly around immigration, anti-miscegenation laws, residential segregation, had actually served as a direct model for Nazi jurists and policymakers in Germany in the 1930s.
Wait, the U.S. laws were a model for the Nazis.
In some specific areas, yes. They looked at how the U.S. handled citizenship for certain groups, segregation.
So the U.S., which had provided some inspiration for Nazi racial laws, then positioned itself as the sole benevolent agent of justice at Nuremberg.
It's a stark contradiction. And this maneuver allowed the principle of state sovereignty to drastically outweigh concerns for universal human rights when it came to domestic affairs. It effectively made history's judgment inseparable from the legal judgments delivered by the state itself.
It was a very neat way to declare the massive debt of racism somehow paid in full, without actually having to look inward or change structures at home.
So this critique of the state as the final agent of justice is really central to modern calls for historical accountability. When states do try to address past injustices, they face this fundamental choice. Do they pursue individual forgiveness or do they push for structural justice?
Right.
And we can see this clearly by comparing that Nuremberg approach with, say, the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the TRC.
Okay, the South African TRC, established in 1996 after apartheid. It explicitly rejected that punitive Nuremberg model, didn't it?
It did. Its mandate was different. It was about exposing the truth of apartheid as a system and trying to enforce its judgment of history through more moral means, focusing on collective memory, individual forgiveness, rather than purely legal retribution.
Right. They had victims recount their experiences, often in horrific detail, very publicly. The idea was to document history's truth.
Mm-hmm. The goal was that this exposure of truth would somehow set the terms for national reconciliation. But this created a really profound confusion, a tension between the order of forgiveness, which is ultimately an individual moral act, and the order of justice, which is really a state prerogative involving redistribution, legal consequences, structural change.
So ultimately, the TRC tried to achieve national reconciliation, a political goal, a necessity, but primarily by moral means alone.
That's the core critique. And crucially, that focus on individual forgiveness really limited the amount of structural change that could have been achieved.
Absolutely.
Because the negotiated settlement that ended apartheid, it left established property rights completely in place.
Oh, that's key.
It is. It meant that property acquired under apartheid laws that explicitly sanctioned theft, dispossession, discrimination, that property was protected in the new South African Constitution's Bill of Rights.
Wow. So even as political rights were extended to the Black majority, the deep-seated social and economic inequalities, the ones rooted in that historical dispossession, they were basically left untouched.
Largely, yes. As one critic put it, reconciliation was the Trojan horse used to smuggle unpleasant aspects of the past into the present political order.
So the state abolished the political distinctions based on race, but it allowed the private wealth and property acquired through historical injustice to just continue operating without real consequence.
And this failure to address the systemic economic debt is precisely what the U.S. reparations movement is designed to confront.
Okay, connecting it back to the U.S.
Yes. The movement asserts that the debt owed for the original sin of slavery has simply never been repaid. It directly challenges that historical narrative that the Civil War or Reconstruction somehow marked the time of death for slavery's evil.
This is such a critical linkage. Reparations advocates like Ta-Nehisi Coates argue that slavery wasn't just a historical crime that ended, it's a continuing disaster, rooted in a predatory form of capitalism that made race a primary instrument of its rule. It's not just a theory about the past, it's presented as a current economic and social fact.
And the debt is explicitly seen as structural, not just, a one-time financial payout. The post-slavery history is read as one of systematic denial of opportunity, reinforcing that system of citizenism through economic means.
Right. When Reconstruction's promise was withdrawn, Black Americans were structurally excluded from the very measures that were designed to create the modern American middle class for white Americans.
We have to look at the specific legislation here. New Deal measures like Social Security insurance, and especially the GI Bill after World War II.
Hugely important programs.
Hugely important, but often implemented at the local level in ways that effectively excluded Black Americans. This led directly to compounding poverty and debt across generations.
Let's talk about the GI Bill. After WWII, millions of returning white veterans got access to low-interest mortgages, free college tuition. It rapidly built generational wealth for white families.
Right, but Black veterans were routinely denied access to those same benefits by local administrations, by banks, even by Veterans Affairs offices.
So they were prevented from accessing the capital needed to buy homes or get education at anything close to the same rate.
It was a massive, federally sanctioned transfer of wealth to one racial group and a simultaneous denial of that wealth to another.
And the structural debt was then cemented by Federal Housing Administration, FHA policies, right? Starting in the 1930s, the FHA openly endorsed segregated housing. They issued these residential security maps.
the infamous redlining maps.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Which categorized neighborhoods based on racial homogeneity.
They systematically redline Black and mixed-race neighborhoods, declaring them too risky for government-insured mortgages.
Which trapped Black Americans in segregated areas with devaluing properties.
While at the same time, white Americans were actively incentivized to move to newly built segregated suburbs with government-backed low-interest loans. This was the direct, systematic denial of generational wealth building on a massive scale.
It's been noted that in places like Chicago, the FHA's policies were so explicitly racial that, quote, they could have been written into the Nuremberg laws. That's how stark it was.
And this compounded debt over decades created the vast Black-white wealth divide that we still see so clearly today.
So the demand for reparations, then, it's not just about a literal check for individuals, is it?
No, it's much broader. It's framed as a demand for a moral and reparatory history. It refuses that clean, progressive narrative of American democracy.
It calls for a national reckoning that would lead to spiritual renewal.
Right. It's a defiant rereading of American history that reveals the structures of white supremacy not as some temporary, removable tumor, but as, quote, native and essential to that body.
Yeah.
Okay. So this detailed exposure of structural violence against citizens of color, combined with this ongoing demand for reparations and acknowledgement of systemic economic debt, it has really profound geopolitical ramifications.
How so?
Well, when the U.S. presents itself on the world stage as the avatar of liberal progress, as the model democracy.
Which it often does.
Right. Its own unflinching internal self-critique concepts like citizenism, the arguments of reparations, they fundamentally undermine that moral authority globally.
And as you noted earlier, this isn't entirely new, this vulnerability. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union strategically used racial injustice in the U.S., segregation, lynching, voter suppression as propaganda, right?
Oh, constantly. It was a major tool in their diplomatic toolkit, used as an indictment of capitalist democracy, especially to woo nations in the newly independent global South.
And today, rival powers, maybe most notably the Chinese Communist Party, they seem to be continuing this strategy. They leverage the very language of American self-critique.
That's a key point. They strategically use concepts like citizenism, the findings of critical race theory, the documented economic inequalities highlighted by the reparations movement.
But not as evidence that America can self-correct.
No, exactly the opposite. They use it as proof of systemic failure, of inherent hypocrisy, even of terminal decline.
And this strategic use becomes particularly potent in diplomacy with the global South, doesn't it?
Yeah.
When the U.S. tries to lecture other nations on human rights or democratic values.
Right. Rivals can immediately point to the persistence of citizenism within the U.S. You know, American citizens detained for speaking Spanish, the systematic surveillance of Muslim citizens, the massive racial wealth gap rooted in structural denial.
The argument becomes pretty simple. How can a nation that seems to institutionalize violence and structural poverty against its own citizens claim the moral high ground to judge others?
Exactly. China, for instance, often frames the U.S. struggle, especially during moments of high racial tension, like the Black Lives Matter movement, not as a failure to live up to its own democratic ideals, but as proof of the inherent hypocrisy and flaws of Western democracy itself.
And this plays directly into these contrasting national unity narratives, doesn't it? The U.S. narrative is constantly struggling with its history of racial exclusion, defining who got full rights. That's citizenism. So the internal critique here is all about forcing the nation to acknowledge the structural barriers that prevent the people from being truly universal and inclusive.
Whereas, in contrast, a nation like China constructs its unity narrative more around political exclusion and forced ideological conformity. It maintains its authority by strictly controlling which parts of its own history can even be discussed or exposed.
Right.
So when Beijing challenges the U.S. on human rights, they are often very effectively leveraging American self-critique to deflect attention from their own human rights record and undermine U.S. soft power.
This whole struggle really shows that the battle isn't just over present-day policy. It's fundamentally over the legitimacy of the historical narrative itself.
Yeah, absolutely.
The demand for reparations is a demand for a completely different view of history, one that's discontinuous, non-linear, one that rejects that comforting progressive fantasy. And that demand itself becomes politically potent on the global stage.
External rivals definitely view this detailed exposure of the state's failures, this internal critique, as evidence that the American model might be collapsing under the weight of its own historical contradictions.
It suggests that maintaining that image of a civilized nation is always fragile.
It is. And the pursuit of actual justice seems to require confronting that fragility head-on, even if doing so provides ammunition to rivals who are eager to challenge that narrative of inevitable American progress. Hashtag tech hack outro.
So to kind of summarize our deep dive today,
Yeah.
citizenism really defines this sophisticated mechanism. It's how the U.S. weaponizes the seemingly race-neutral concept of citizenship to maintain structural subordination across communities of color.
And the cases we discussed, mass deportation, internment, modern racial profiling, they starkly demonstrate that for citizens of color, rights are often treated as perpetually suspect, conditional, and ultimately removable whenever that action is premised on the racialized fear of the illegal other.
And the movement for historical accountability, especially reparations, is this powerful structural refusal to accept the state's preferred narrative of continuous progressive improvement. It's a defiant stand insisting that the debt the nation owes is both moral and financial, and that it has compounded over centuries because of explicit state policies like FHA redlining and the discriminatory application of things like the GI Bill.
And bringing it right back to your family dinner story at the beginning, that desperate call for unity, it's so often really a desire for the past to just be past, for the debt to be somehow marked paid in full and forgotten.
Just sweep it under the rug.
Exactly. But the evidence of citizenism and the continuing demand for reparations, they show that the political economy of race means the past is still, as one writer put it, awful and undead. It's constantly haunting and limiting the present.
And the ultimate insight here, maybe, is the potential remedy that comes just from recognition, from naming the problem.
Yes.
The power of naming this specific form of discrimination, citizenism, seems profound. It feels similar to when sexual harassment was finally named back in the mid-1970s.
That's a great analogy.
Before that term existed, victims often lacked clear legal avenues because the harm was dismissed as just a personal slight, not a systemic civil rights violation.
All right.
So maybe recognizing citizenism provides a structure, a dignity to an experience of civil rights violation that was previously just dismissed as unfortunate immigration control or maybe individual police misconduct. It potentially opens avenues for real structural legal reform.
Because structural inequality requires more than just changing the laws on paper. It seems to require fundamentally revising the historical narrative that the law claims to serve. And maybe the fight for true justice has to begin by accepting that uncomfortable exposure over a false, fragile unity.